glad all 5 of you could make it out today. I've got a bit of a cold, so my voice does have a bit of a very low and sexy tone, but if I have to cough into the corner, please just pretend I'm saying something relevant to my voice. Great. So, one genre of cinema that's never had the best of reputations is horror. It's associated with rampant misogyny, racism, exploitation, etc. And even when it's immensely popular, it's easily dismissed as a lesser form of cinema. And it's kind of understandable because there's blood, and there's guts, and there's mainly women getting chopped up, and there's people running away scared, and it's great! However, there's more than one level operating to make horror engaging, and not all of these levels are sadistic. I'm here to think about the role of the protagonist in evoking empathy and sympathy in Western horror cinema. I've identified the main ways they play a valuable part of the horror experience. This includes how the genre has changed over the decades and why this is, reviewing the common plot structures and how empathy and sympathy have an essential place even in inevitable formulas, and examining the use of social allegory with horror that draws on its social context. So, firstly, I think it's important to define the differences between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy means feeling sorrow through someone else's visible plight, whereas empathy means to understand specifically because you've experienced it for yourself. Now, this may seem like pretty basic stuff, but this distinction becomes important because horror has changed over the decades, so people can relate to its protagonists more. Horror cinema started with its roots in Gothic literature, such as Dracula and the Wolfman and Frankenstein. And there was a very deliberate shift in setting and in characterization to make the protagonists from around the 80s onwards to be as much like normal people as possible. Tony Normand and Graham Marsh note, horror films in the 20s and 30s placed the ghouls a safe distance from the audience enjoying their escapist thrills. In the 80s, it was brought into our own homes and everyday lives. Emphasis there on the word escapist, because in traditional horror, the hero has a passive role, having the plot mainly happen to them, as opposed to having them really cause the plot to advance. They might eventually vanquish the evil, but even for audiences of the time, there was a level of disengagement where any normalcy or relation to the audience at home is treated as uninteresting rather than as a source of terror like it is nowadays. The audience feels sympathy when this character is in danger, but not exactly empathy. One of the well-renowned recent examples of this is from the film Get Out by Jordan Peele, a film about a black man meeting his white girlfriend's family for the first time. His trials of the every person utilise the racism of America to make him a chilling, empathetic core. Like many effective horror films, it features a setting of isolation, yet this isolated environment is the scenario of going to meet your girlfriend's family for the first time. Additionally, the realistic goals and aspirations of the main character Chris, like his job as a photographer, his love for his girlfriend, and his aspiration to quit smoking, become very central plot points. So, for those of you who are kind of aware of the plot structure of a slasher, you might ask, what good does it do to create empathy and sympathy in a genre where the characters are, to a point, kind of dispensable and killed off really quickly, often in a very camp and overly bloody way? The relationship that the filmmakers intend the audience to have with their characters is very clearly signposted in its advertising, which overwhelmingly employs personal you pronouns. And wow, that's way more pixelated than it originally was. You can't read, there is a you there. And this is a tactic that's spanned across decades of filmmaking and of horror advertising. Audience participation is in a sense required, but unlike other genres like the crime thriller where you're looking to see who did it and trying to analyse the clues, the audience participation is not an active one, it's a helpless one. The audience is invited to partake in the dramatic irony when the killer is stalking from point of view shot, but likewise when the audience themselves are left in suspense and entreated to the vicarious suffering of the protagonist. Whether the threat is a serial killer, disease, zombies, or a supernatural entity, the best way to describe all of these antagonists could be the word intrusions. It could be argued that since these intrusions are felt enabling the idea that something's invading on your space, it can be said to create both sympathy and empathy automatically, but the audience is invited to share with the thrills and terror of the situation, not of the character's plight. The protagonist in the horror film is essentially a vessel to be tormented. Thomas Fay agrees that the victim function renders protagonists to be viewed through this lens regardless of how much time is spent on character development, saying, what sympathy exists between the viewer and the victim is likely to be more visceral than emotional. Ooh, visceral, great word. Use it in every single sentence I've ever said pretty much. However, other enthusiasts like Joseph Ledoux argue that the human brain can't help but empathise, even among a predictable formula, because he reasoned empathy may be what allows them to feel the anxiety and fear that the characters are experiencing. The primary reason people can enjoy horror films is because of that catharsis and ability to feel an enjoyable rush of increased adrenaline in a safe environment. Whatever monster is stalking the doomed protagonist, one could argue that the audience notices this as danger and wishes the figure on screen to try and escape, whether or not this character is hinted to be expendable or not. Now, there are some names that I cannot really pronounce, so I'm probably going to butcher them, of Elsesser and Hagener, sorry, similarly touched upon the ideas of bodily imagery being a channel for vicarious enjoyment, noting that the low cultural status of horror films derives from the sight of the body in its most inarticulate manifestations, but also from the fact that such bodily reactions reach out to envelope and touch the spectator. The physical reaction to viewing sadism on screen creates a sense that investment occurs enough to respect the character's personhood and their mortality, which wouldn't be if zero interest had ever been cultivated in the first bit of the film. Additionally, it should be noted that two films, Alien and The Thing, have been regarded as the best simply because they spend much of their time in the first half making their characters with as much personhood as possible, putting their personhood and their relationships front and foremost, way before they are ever victims. Now, cinema is more than just reflective of the public consciousness. It is the public consciousness. Paul Wells cites the fact that the history of the horror film is essentially a history of anxiety in the 20th century. Anxiety, a thing that I am sure we are all feeling at all points, even now. Advertising from the 1930s onwards, which would look beautiful. Oh, that was not pixelated, fantastic! From the 1930s onwards, featuring monsters descending upon helpless civilians and spaceships, reflect many of the societal fears of the times. It's a window into collective angst. Now, traditional horror dealt mainly with the allegorical, and representing foes in a subtextual manner, apart from this one, where the threat is a woman. Whoa! But modern horror has even less use for this subtlety. This can be seen in stuff like the anti-consumerist They Live, where the rich and powerful are aliens infiltrating humanity, and the satirical The Stuff, where an alien substance is commodified and sold only for it to start consuming humans. In these films, the protagonists, who are usually aware of the complete manipulation by capitalism, either end up failing or end up saving others at the cost of their own lives. These characters were underdogs, which speaks to the audiences who felt powerless as individuals. Now, it's also not an accident that in times of social or economic upheaval, horror films have seen an increased demand. For example, the torture porn genre emerged after 9/11. This features franchises like Hostel and Saw, to the point where looking at the posters for these films was really not a good experience. I did not like them at all. Now, in these kinds of films, it's not actually porn, but the focus is on extreme gore and visuals of huge amounts of butchery, where all characters are pretty much completely dispensable. Now, it has far more exaggerated brutality than the now comparably tamed Texas Chainsaw Massacre. During this period of America, it was experiencing its first act of terrorism with many casualties, and social divisions began to heighten as the general public was subjected to the ideas of increasing danger. Nobody exists outside of their surrounding cultural anxiety, and therefore there's an inbuilt awareness of the climate the viewer is existing in, which inevitably creates characters that reflect these levels of empathetic characterization. Now, there is so much to talk about with a topic like this that lots of discussion is able to be had on every single one of the points that I've made here. And I would if I did not have a time limit. Now, I'm not trying to claim that every horror film is a sensitive rendition to the human condition, because like many areas of cinema, it's primarily directed by men and primarily aimed towards men, which I'm not trying to be sexist, but that's not great. Sorry, men. But neither do I want to disparage the films that actually revel in this carnival-esque spectacle and the joy of being scared. And I believe that for a horror film to be successful, it needs to carve out a place for sympathy or empathy. The catharsis provided through the extreme emotion contains an essential sense of identification. I believe that a softer side exists to the genre, not in spite of the blood and gore, but because of it. It requires investment because without the idea of survival being at stake, there is no fear and no reason to invest in any of the characters, even the antagonist. And that would be the worst crime of all, making a boring film.